This one on the Tower of Babel is fairly short, and contains a mix of good and bad. Fairley does get absolutely correct that the tower was more likely a ziggurat, or pyramid shape, rather than a tower as we know the term. It's also correct that it was meant to imitate a sacred mountain. On the downside, we have a repeat of the errors reading Satan into Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. It's also far from clear that Nimrod sat on top of this thing giving counsel. But the most questionable claim at all is that 600,000 people took part in the construction of the tower. Really? Now, where do you suppose that came from? Well, actually, there's only one source that seems to mention it. Where's this from? Well, that's the problem. It's from something called the Book of Jasher. And no, it's not the one referred to in the Bible. This Book of Jasher is a very late forgery and isn't considered authentic by any scholar. Using that by itself means that this vid gets a rating of a quarter tank. This one's also on the Tower of Babel, but it's less history, more baseless speculation. The one main thing correct is that the point of the tower wasn't the height, but access to the gods, as the names of the other ziggurats do demonstrate. It's also possibly correct that one of the motives for building the tower was to defy God's command to populate the land. In contrast, several points are merely wild speculation with no historical support, such as the specific uses designated by Nimrod and Semiramis, who, as we noted, were not contemporaries at all, as well as the origins of the all-seeing eye symbol with Nimrod. It's also wrong to that extent that all such symbols come from the same source. It would seem quite obvious, for example, that an all-seeing eye would make an accurate symbol of any deity. But the specific case of the eye inside the triangle is a solely Christian representation, one that represents the Trinity. It was used in European churches, as has been documented by sources like this one, a professional art historian. Now at this point you may be thinking, wait a minute, Christians wouldn't borrow a pagan symbol, right? Well, wrong. And since this is a point we'll be returning to repeatedly in later replies, we're going to lay out an important concept of our replies now. The fact is, the early church was known for taking over, revamping, and claiming for their own various pagan depictions, as a sort of in-your-face way of letting the pagans know who was boss. Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries was particularly good at this. Here you can see that the pagan deity Mithra is depicted slaying the bull while riding on its back. Well, to answer that, the church did a look-alike scene with Samson killing a lion. In another picture, Mithra sent arrows into a rock to bring forth water. The church answered that by changing Mithra into Moses, getting water from the rock. It was kind of like a Pepsi versus Coke sort of thing. Or Pokemon versus Digimon. You know what I mean. We'll refer to this idea more than a few times in this series from now on, so we'll designate a term for it. We'll call it triumphant reclamation. As for the actual origins of the all-seeing eye symbol, the best candidate isn't Nimrod, it's the Egyptians, and their use of the eye for a symbol of the deity Horus. Needless to say, any idea of it representing Lucifer is just paranoia. The other claim I'll address is this one. It's said that the translation of this verse partially masks the true meaning. And we're told, according to Roger Christofferson, the Hebrew text, "Let us make a great name," reads, "Let us provide our own salvation." In other words, people were attempting to work their own way to salvation independently of God. Well, first of all, quite frankly, who the heck is Roger Christofferson, and why should we believe him over credentialed Bible translators? We shouldn't. Christofferson is just some nobody with a website, and there's not a single reason to read this text in terms of providing our own salvation. The Hebrew text does read, "Let us make a name," but the word for name seen here in other passages means name, not salvation. And this relates to another problem with Know Your Enemy that we'll be seeing repeatedly. Again and again, Fairley accepts as accurate various points he finds from entirely unqualified sources. He clearly doesn't check their claims, and also doesn't make use of any credible sources. This is a serious problem in the series, and it's at the root of most of its other problems too. So, this one gets another quarter tank when it comes to scholarship. This one's about what Fairley calls the Mysteries, a religious system he supposes was invented by Nimrod and Semiramis. Since pairing those two together historically is already a blunder, it doesn't take much more to say that any claim of a religion they invented is also wrong. Now, to be sure, there are and have been all kinds of false religions that refer to secret knowledge as the way to salvation, and of giving humans what is reckoned to be godlike powers or knowledge via some sort of route of progression. In the New Testament era, for example, a movement we now call Gnosticism was well known for that. So in terms of the existence of such religions, Fairley does get that much broadly correct. But there's no need to invent a backstory to support this fact. It's also true that sometimes, not always, these mystery religions made use of sex as an element of their worship. Sometimes the reverse was true and celibacy was the ideal. The Gnostics had a branch in their system that accepted this. But once again, adding on a backstory about Nimrod and Semiramis that is absolutely undocumented in real history isn't necessary. Also included in Fairley's backstory are claims about the origins of astrology. For example, it is said it was believed by Noah's righteous ancestors that the stars told the story of Satan's rebellion against God in heaven and his fall, and so on. Well, no. Although there have been theories that the gospel is retold in the stars, and these ideas have been endorsed even by some well-known authors like D. James Kennedy, it's also been rejected by equally credible, and in some cases far more qualified commentators. I'll add a link in the vid description to those. In any event, this idea of finding the gospel in the stars tends to rely more on stretching things creatively than anything else, a sort of astronomical midrash. And there's not a lick of historical evidence that anyone earlier than the 19th century, least of all Noah's righteous ancestors, believed such a thing. So this one gets an empty tank, mainly for inventing stuff, or borrowing invented stuff uncritically. This one begins with another creative backstory on Nimrod and Semiramis that has no support in the historical record. Beyond that, does Fairley get anything right here, particularly about the figure in the title of the vid, Tammuz? He gets a few general points right, like the names of some of the ancient pagan gods. But in real history, the actual origins of these figures is simply unknown to us, although it is assuredly not the case that they derive from the historical figures of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz. So, this one's empty. The main theme of Part 10 in Fairley's series is that there are many variations of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz to be found in other incarnations and other societies. Once again, since this is based in good measure on a counterfeit and contrived history connecting those three, to that extent it's already wrong. Less questionable is the idea that some gods can be found in different forms in different societies. The most well-known examples would be the way certain Greek gods were transferred to the Roman pantheon, such as Zeus becoming Jupiter. But does that mean that all false religions sprang from Mystery Babylon religion, as Fairley says? Well, no. And I can't say a whole lot more on this without Fairley making specific claims about alleged derivations, which he apparently won't do since he says he won't offer any in-depth analysis of such claims. But I can give you an example of how certain atheists misuse and abuse the evidence to make similar claims. And we'll discuss this here in some detail since it's a form of argument Fairley will return to again and again in his series. There's an excellent example in this vid also on my channel showing how critics try to use the story of the Egyptian deity Osiris to claim that the story of Jesus rising from the dead was stolen from Egypt. The sort of terminological equivocation the critics use there is exactly the sort of fact-bending that Christian conspiracy theorists like Fairley use as well. To use one example Fairley gives, he points out that the various goddesses might all be called something like the Great Mother. Unfortunately, he doesn't name any of them. But here's the thing. Ancient people always thought of themselves and their deities in familial terms. That means it was natural to refer to deities in terms of father or mother. So just because Goddess A over here was called Mother, and so was Goddess B over here, that doesn't mean they're in any way related. It's just the normal way ancient people used family language to express their relationship between themselves and their gods. We'll see many more examples of this sort of thing and know your enemy as we progress. Fairley is simply too eager and ready to draw parallels based on the assumption of some sort of satanic inspiration, when in reality the evidence points to far more prosaic explanations. So I'll give this one a rating of a quarter tank. Aside from a couple of allusions to the contrived idea of a Nimrod-inspired mystery religion, Part 11 is mostly a recapitulation of the biblical narrative, so we'll rate that one neutral. Part 12 continues mostly with biblical recapitulation, but there are a few mistakes. The idea that the 10 plagues were in some way an answer to the gods of Egypt isn't entirely unreasonable, and has had some scholarly support. But Fairley says that the 4th plague of flies was directed at Khepri, who he says had the head of a fly. Actually, Khepri had the head of a scarab beetle, not the head of a fly. Though of course that may not matter to some people. We would also take issue with the idea that Isis was a version of Semiramis. The only evidence Fairley provides for this is that Isis, like Semiramis, wore a crown. But crowns or headpieces were worn by many royal and divine figures, especially in Egypt. I'd also like to contest the claim that the number 10 represents completeness in pagan numerology. Really? Well, that could be true, somewhere. As it is, I found the same claim made of the numbers 8, 9, and 12, but not 10. At least not yet. So there's not much to rate here, and what there is gets this one a half tank. This one's also mostly biblical recapitulation, aside from a few allusions once again to those contrived ideas about Nimrod, so we'll also rate this one neutral.